Hello everyone, I'm Carolyn Waters, the head librarian. Welcome to the New York Society Library. I'd like to ask you before we start to please turn off your cell phone or anything that might disrupt the conversation. We don't want to be that person. I am delighted to introduce our presenters this evening. Longtime friends, both are scientists as well as writers, and their scientific interests just happen to converge on olfaction, the science of smell. And actually, as I was writing this, I was thinking, we should have those scratch and sniff parts. We could have a conversation in Odorama. Wouldn't that have been great? So let me tell you a little bit about these two. Alexandra Horowitz has taught at Barnard College since 2004. She currently runs the Dog Cognition Lab, testing the olfactory experience of the domestic dog through experiments in natural settings. In her most recent book, Being a Dog, Following the Dog into a World of Smell, she hilariously recounts her escapades in sniffing along walks with her own dogs and investigates what humans can learn from paying attention to the smells like dogs do. She's also the author of 2 previous books on Looking, A Walker's Guide to the Art of Observation, and Inside of a Dog, What Dogs See, Smell, and Know. And she lectured on both of these here at the library, and those videotapes are available on our website and also on our YouTube channel, so you should definitely check those out. Stuart J. Firestein is the chair of the Department of Biological Sciences at Columbia University, where his laboratory is researching the vertebrate olfactory receptor neuron. Is that correct? I have no idea what that is. Dr. Firestein is the author of 2 books, Ignorance, How It Drives Science, and his most recent, published last year, Failure, Why Science is So Successful, in which we learn that the greatest thing to hear in a lab is not eureka, but, why did that happen? He has also published articles in Wired Magazine and Scientific American, and he has been elected as a fellow by the American Association for the Advancement of Science for his meritorious efforts to advance science, and is an advisor to the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation Program for the Public Understanding of Science. So please join me in welcoming Alexandra Horowitz and Stuart Firestein.
Very quick correction though. I'm the former chair of the Department of Biological Sciences, having left the position a couple years ago. I'm still a member of the faculty there, but former I've learned is the most important word to compare with chair. So I want that on the record. All right, now we can get started.
Hello.
Good? Okay.
Good. So thank you all for coming. Thank you, Karen, for our introduction, Sarah, for setting up this event. It's fun for me to be here as a member, and as a member writer, somebody who spent a lot of time on the 5th floor writing these books. Maybe you've heard me complain about the noise I was making.
Is your dog here with you?
No, the dog was definitely not allowed. And I'm also really happy to be talking to Stuart, who was in my latest book, actually as a representative of knower of things, human olfactory, which is some component of my book. But so I thought I would just add a little bit to our introduction. We'd introduce ourselves, and then we'll get into talking about how we smell and things we don't know and fail at. So I am, as Carolyn said, I am a researcher into dog cognition. My interest is really what it might be like to be another animal, and my species of choice is the dog. And so I do this through ethological observations of what a dog is doing in their natural world, some testing of dog behavior in simple experimental settings, and also recently through trying to find out more about the olfactory world. And so this brought me to my latest book, where I not only tried to find out a lot about dog sense of smell, and did, but also tried to make myself more like a dog, a better smeller, and train myself in smelling. So would you like to say a little more about why
Hard to top that, but okay. I'll do my best. I got interested in the olfactory system, the sense of smell, some years ago. I was interested in neuroscience and in behavior, and I thought, well, what's that sensory system that for so many animals, and I'd like to say, I hope to show you tonight as well, humans, is so important for so many of our behaviors, is so closely associated with behaviors, even more than any of our other senses, I think. And so I got into olfaction also because it was a field that was under-investigated and understudied at the time. And so there were lots of opportunities. There was a huge number of questions. We knew surprisingly little about this sense, in spite of possessing what is arguably the best chemical detector on the face of the planet, and other animals, even better ones. And so I started working in the sense of smell. My other interest that brings me here tonight, I suppose, is the public understanding or accessibility of the public to science, because I think that's an incredibly important thing in this world. I'm sure I don't have to make that case here in any way. But you know, I mean, I think if you think the Reformation was important or the Renaissance was important, then I think the scientific revolution is of equal importance in all of our lives. We live in a culture that's immersed in science in many ways. We use it all the time, and I think we should be able to understand it culturally as well. And so that's my interest in science and communicating science. Not so much the facts of it, which are nice to know if you feel like knowing them, but there are a lot of facts, so you'll never know all of them. None of us ever will. But rather a kind of a scientific approach, a scientific perspective, a scientific sense of the world that blends very well with an artistic sense of the world, with a scholarly sense of the world, with the humanities and the social sense of the world as well.
Yeah.
So we can make that case for a while.
Yeah, well, I mean, I thought we might start with facts, even though they're not all of
Sure.
the sciences. I mean, one of the interesting things about your book, your latest book, Failure, is that you do make, I think, a really good case for the fact that, for the notion that actually science might not be getting that much closer to the truth. A lot of what counts as science isn't true.
So science has never been after truth with capital T.
Yeah.
I think that's an unfortunate mistake that so many people make about it. I don't think the truth, certainly with a capital T, is what science aims for. Science aims for understanding, for explanation, for facts that last for a while. A friend of mine, a fellow named Samuel Arbisman, wrote a book that I recommend highly called The Half-Life of Facts, in which he traces how long a fact lasts. They don't last that long. It's only recently that we've had this great deal of respect for facts, and only more recently that we seem to have less respect
And
for
then we have
facts.
to really defend our facts and
Yes,
hold them up. And also, we're
yes.
all introduced to science through facts, right? I mean, science teaching
Yes.
is about memorizing facts, learning facts, and part of this is so that you can get caught up as a beginning chemist or beginning biologist to participate in the game of
Right,
science, right?
Right.
But part of it is sort of saying that we value these facts. And a lot of what I write about, as a matter of fact, when people want to know about the dog nose, is
Yeah.
I'll start to tell you facts.
Yeah.
That's the first thing I'll do, right? And I'm not saying that we therefore have an understanding. I think it's really interesting that we kind of don't have an understanding.
No, the more you know, the more you don't know, and that sounds almost trivial, but that's what the book Ignorance is about to me. That's what scientific ignorance is.
Yeah.
It's not stupidity, it's not knowing. We know a vast amount. I mean, there's stacks and stacks of books in this building, and that's only a small chunk of what we actually know. And in spite of that, what we don't know is still much larger. And it never gets any smaller. In fact, I'd say it gets bigger. The more you know, the greater the circumference, as it were, of what you don't know is, the more in touch you are with what you don't know. So for me, not knowing, ignorance, the idea of getting an answer, the idea of getting a fact, is to lead you to a better question.
Yeah.
That's what we're after, is better questions.
Well, I think olfaction's a pretty interesting model for that. I mean, when I started to explore the questions about the dog's olfaction, well, first of all, it hadn't been assiduously, carefully explored. In other words, we sort of all have an understanding the dog is a great smeller, right? And then we kind of ended at that. Like, that's our fact, and we wield it, and we can go around with it, and we can tell people about it, and they can nod their head and be impressed. And as a scientist, I'm interested in, all right, well, is that fact true?
Yeah.
And then why is it, right? And why would they be better smellers? And what makes them a better smeller?
Yeah.
And so one of the things I wound up sort of queuing up is from different fields, all bits of evidence about how a dog's nose is different than our nose, there are really interesting differences. So we have these olfactory receptors right at the back of our nose, which are where the odors are grabbed by the cells. You can correct me in my language at any time. She's the real olfactory scientist. And convert it into something which later we'll call a smell. We have dogs have hundreds of millions more in their noses than we do. They have those long snouts.
I'd say tens of millions.
No, that some of them have hundreds of millions.
Really?
Yeah, well, some up to a billion anyway.
Really?
So, and I think we have less than 100 million.
Yeah, we have about 10 to 20 million.
So consider,
Yes.
a lot more. And that seems significant in some
Yeah.
yet undefined way. And so already we have something else we're ignorant about. Like we know something else, but we don't know how that's useful.
Right.
They have these long snouts with all of these bones called turbinate bones, right? Some of which are lined with cells. And this seems to somehow help their sniffing. Potentially it's making the speed of the odor getting back to the cells faster. Maybe it's cleaning out particles that would be damaging.
Yeah.
But our noses are far less complicated, right? Like we have a few simple bones in our nose, and dogs have this elaborate, like brain-like structure, where an odor must take a roller coaster ride to get to the smelling part. So there's that, but how it works, we don't know.
Right. So like many sensory systems, I think there's always some mechanical piece up front that increases the intensity of the stimulus. So if it's the lens of your eyes or the flaps of your ears, some animals have much bigger flaps, and that increases their sense of hearing. The hairs on your skin actually are crucial to touch. I mean, you wouldn't be able to sense a little bug crawling on your skin were it not for the fact that it moves a couple of hairs around, and that's what you actually sense, because your sensory receptors are not sensitive enough for the weight of a bug, as it were. So every sensory system has some upfront mechanical mechanism for increasing the intensity.
Yeah.
In this case, it's your schnoz, as it were, right?
Right, but not for us, right? My understanding is like having a big nose as a human is not helping you, right?
No, in fact.
I didn't mean you.
I understand. I can take it that way.
Everyone's
No, and in fact, I have a terrible sense of smell, in spite of the size of my nose. Yes, terrible. But what you learn is that many people complain about their sense of smell. I mean,
everyone complains about their sense of smell, right?
Yeah, it seems so because.
How many people here think they have a good sense of smell? Oh my God! Oh, you're an aberrant audience. Oh, that was the last question I asked.
They're a little frightening.
Yeah, no, that's actually surprising.
I'm a little worried.
But a lot of people do believe that they have a poor sense of smell.
I believe so. I mean, my wife who's sitting in the back smells all sorts of things that I don't smell, and blames me for it.
But
incorrectly, but.
But it's not due to this is another kind of misunderstanding. I'm really interested in the fact that we have a kind of lay understanding of dogs per se. We may or may not be right about what we know about dogs, but we just assume we do have an understanding because, of course, they're in our homes, and so we assume, he's sleeping on my bed. I probably know a lot about it, but those things haven't been tested. And one of the other things is that there's sort of a sense of smell, like as a sort of a magical sense that people sort of have a good one or not, like a good or bad memory. Kind of interesting folk idea of how cognition and perception work.
You can train yourself. I mean, perfumers and chefs are trained. There are schools you can go to, and you can become better at it. An awful lot of it has to do with, so most of the time, a poor sense of smell in a person is not neurological. It's not a brain issue. It's not really a sensory issue. It's allergies or sinusitis of some sort, inflammation, the tissue up here.
Problem with the mechanism.
Yes, right. So the trouble with having such a short nose now compared to other animals, I mean, our noses all became foreshortened when our jaws got smaller, when our faces got rearranged for all sorts of evolutionary reasons that people think. And but what happened was the nose, it got very tight up there. This is a little mildly disgusting, but if you're an otolaryngologist and you stick a little camera up there with a bright light on it, and they do that to look for polyps and things like that, right? If you ever get into that situation where you need that done, you should watch it. You would be shocked at how tight it is up there. So the odor molecules literally can barely get to your nasal epithelium where the cells are tucked away back in here. So I think people with a better sense of smell, like perfumers or chefs, let's say, or things like that, are people that either are less susceptible to swelling in the tissue, or they simply have a bone structure that's a little bit wider up there, which you may not see outwardly, but inwardly, it's a wider sort of set of cavities. And so it's an access issue as much as anything else.
Right, but then the perfumers and the sommeliers and so forth, they've also practiced smelling
Yes.
a lot. So they're doing almost what you're doing right there. That they're
Yeah.
bothering to say, there's something in front of me.
Right.
I'm going to try to smell it, which is something, I think rare. Have you smelled anything today?
It's kind of a personal.
Yeah, it does seem like a personal.
Well, at least it's a personal answer.
All right, then that's at your discretion.
I did. I was actually on the way here, but it's interesting because it's typical of having quite a bad sense of smell coming out of the subway at 79th Street on the west side. So I came out of 79th and Broadway. I was hit in the face with some dreadful smell. Well, there's a lot of them around right now because it's so hot out, of course. So the city just reeks in general. Even to me, it reeks a bit, And I have no idea what it was. It was some kind of unpleasant metallic sort of odor, which is an unusual odor to have anyway. And maybe it had some foodie stuff mixed in it. I don't know what it was, but I just got through it quickly.
Well, I think that's interesting because that's
Yeah,
really
yeah.
what we mostly do, right?
Yeah, you like these things.
Well, I do now,
Yeah.
right? Well, so my experience was that if I wanted to understand what it was like to be a dog, I had to start thinking about what it might be like to see the world wrought in smells,
Yeah.
right? And that meant I had to start smelling things, And I first did, I don't know if I told you about this, but I first did that by just trying to follow what my dog did, and so my dog, go out with my dog and they make a beeline for the little tree guard right outside our apartment building, and my dog gave it a really good sniff. And so then when Finnegan was done, I got down there and gave it a really good sniff. And it didn't smell as bad as it could have, but it had a very strong smell. But it was sort of a metallic smell, and I was doing this and sniffing, and my dogs then were. I realized stopped and looking at me, and there was a couple walking up the street, and they got off the sidewalk to walk around me. That's how unusual it is to want to sniff something, right? Mostly we do that. We just notice something. Well, but it's surprising in that we allow it totally with the dog without having any idea, basically, what the dog's experience is there. Or maybe we don't allow it with the dog.
Yeah.
Some people don't allow their dogs to sniff. But we don't allow it with us, right? And it would seem rude if I said, "Oh, I smelled you," we had a hug and I smelled. That seems very personal. So I found that to be interesting. But the expert olfactory folks, the people who are dealing in olfaction for their livelihood, like perfume, they have gotten over that. For them, smells are more like, I think, what they're like for the dog, which is they're just information that you can put together in interesting ways or find out, where that wine came from.
Yes, well, I think for them it's, I guess I would say for them, certainly it's information. I think it's also more, they're just simply more conscious of it. So I believe that we're extremely good with our nose. We use our nose a lot. And that when we hug each other hello, we do get a whiff of each other. We just are not doing it quite so consciously. But I think we look for that all the time. And the reason I think that is that we spend billions of dollars every year on doing things to alter our personal odor, because we must be conscious of the fact, and some are unconscious of the fact, that people are getting a whiff of us because we're getting a whiff of them, right? And so we spend all this money to change our, toothpaste and perfumes and hair products and all other sorts of things. And I mean, that doesn't include the even vaster amount of money we spend on products to make our towels smell like lemons, or our bathrooms improbably like a pine forest or something like that, right? Which we do also. So I can tell you, if you go home tonight and you empty out your cupboards, every product, and look at the ingredients, every product you own, including the so-called odor-free ones, by the way, will have an added fragrance or flavor in them.
Right, I think that was the interesting insight to me about that. Unscented products are scented.
Yeah.
To having a smell that doesn't smell like a
That's right.
scent.
Yeah.
Because the thing it's
smell.
masking
Yeah.
is so disgusting smelling to us. The enzymes
Yeah.
that are needed to clean
Yeah, to
your
make
clothes
soaps and
are disgusting smelling. So they
Yeah.
have to put something in
to
so
make
that
it-
we say it's nothing.
Yeah.
Right. So I agree that that is one bit of evidence in a way that we are smelling a lot. But those are all perfumes. I'm sort of interested in the fact that we're so averse to
the
smells of just the world around us the way it is, in situ. And in fact, I talked to a fellow who creates a product sort of like these Febreze, which is an odor eliminator.
Right.
You know, where I think it works basically just by weighting down odors.
Yeah.
Because odors have to be in the air to
Right.
be sniffed, right? Because our nose is up here, so it has to get into our nose. That's why if you want to smell something, you have to go to where it is, do a little scratch and smell it. But otherwise it has to hit your nose. So it just weights down the odors. And he claims that it eliminates all odor. And he said people love this, you know, spray it in a room, and they walk in and they're like, this is heaven. And I thought, well, that's actually really disappointing in a way, that we would want something that has zero smell, that's our ideal.
And that's additionally curious, because people who lose their sense of smell, which happens, it's a condition called anosmia, and it can happen for a variety of reasons. It can be permanent or temporary. It can be an injury, bang on the head or something like that, or it can be a bad cold sometimes, and it'll leave you without a sense of smell for some period of time afterwards. And people who undergo this suffer significant depression and other sorts of psychological distress.
Yeah.
They find it extremely difficult, extremely challenging. Part of the reason is that they don't get much attention paid to them by doctors who go, well, you're lucky it wasn't your eyes or something like that, I guess. And so it's sort of minimalized. But they recognize, for example, that they don't, they always worry that they don't sleep well, because they're worried they won't smell a gas leak or a fire or something like that. So you forget that you have this constantly on guard early warning system on the front of your face until it's gone. And then you go, wow, I mean, things are not here. I knew a young woman who was, I guess she was in her mid-30s at the time, single and sort of active and all that, and she lost her sense of smell. And I went through this with her. I guess you're worried about fire or gas. She said, well, what really worries me is I can't smell the wrong guy. So, you know, she just knew she could smell the wrong guy in a bar. No, thank you.
Right.
And she really missed that. She knew that she was losing information.
Yeah, and the people are I know people with anosmia miss the smell of their spouse or their partner and their parents or child's smell. Just having that around them, even if it probably is in many cases an unconscious experience smell.
Not to be morbid, but it's well known that long-term spouses, if one of them passes away, the last thing people want to get rid of are the clothes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You can put the trinkets away and the memorial, you know, these things get their place. But the clothing people like to keep around because there's a sense of presence in the smell. There's a sense of the
Absolutely. You know, my father passed a few years ago, and I kept a lot of his clothes, and I kept them stuffed up in a ball in a bag. Yeah. Because if you spread them out or something, the odor will just dissipate. And if you dry clean them, that's it. But you know, every once in a while you go visit that smell, and then the person comes back, right? Yeah. So, well, maybe that's an interesting. You know, what do you think about this? What is that connection? I know this isn't the level at which you study olfaction, but the connection that is so interesting to us, that we have, that you can smell something and then a memory pops up.
So, you know, we call this the Proust effect, to be fancy, because it's sort of based on the famous passage in Proust's Remembrance of Things Past, in which he has a sip of lemon tea and a Madeleine cookie, and this memory from 40 years ago of his childhood suddenly comes back, full-blown memory. And he spent 7 or 8 pages describing this and becoming adapted to it, and then it comes back, and then he goes on to write whatever, 700,000 words about memory. So that's a little extreme, that case. But we all have that, right, where we smell something and, invoke some memory. The interesting thing about it is, and then I have a question for you about it, the interesting thing about it is the memories that are evoked are always emotional memories. So you don't smell something and remember a phone number or a page of text or something useful or anything like that. It's always, the first day of school or grandmom's house or your ex-lover or something like that, right? There's always some emotional quality that goes with it. So one question is that true for the dog?
Right.
So dogs clearly have a huge olfactory memory, but is it more, I forget the word now, what would be the word? Is it less sort of emotional and more informational, or is it also emotional?
Yeah, well, that's something I think we're in the realm of speculation there.
Yeah.
My feeling would be that, just looking at the priority of senses for dogs, that given that it is the main medium for getting information, that it is more of just an information store, that dogs' dreams would be primarily in odor, that the recognition of places or people is going to be just strictly through, I mean, you might have a nostalgic visual memory of someone, but mostly you're just remembering. That is, yes, I'm verifying in my head, that's what they look like, and the dog would experience, that's what they smell like. Right, I don't know if there would be any way to really test the idea that there would be an emotional valence to it, but we definitely know they recognize through scent, and they're great. I mean, my favorite subgenre of YouTube videos are these soldiers returning home kind of videos, where you know that people will like to videotape the returning member of the family who's been deployed for years, and they come in the house and they're usually dressed still in their fatigues or in a uniform or something, and the dog starts barking at the person, right? There's no recognition right away, and the person behind the camera will be egging them on, like, come on, don't you recognize it's Daddy, or whatever it is, and then something happens. The person steps forward, offers a hand, or a breeze shifts if they're outside, and suddenly the dog catches a whiff, and it's, they like collapse in a puddle of excitement, basically. Suddenly that's their person, right? So there is an emotional overtone at some level, but I don't think it's that. I feel like part of that emotional overtone, that Proustian thing, is that they're so periodic for us. They're so occasional, and they happen to us usually. We're not going out seeking the smell. It's that you go into suddenly you get off the M79 and some funny metallic smell brings you right back to whenever you were in California and working on that set or whatever it is. And so I think that happens to us in a funny ways. And maybe dogs have something parallel.
So the other memory thing that goes along with olfaction is this, what we call taste aversions, but they're actually olfactory. And that is, we've all had this, I have a colleague who calls it the Lufthansa effect, because, you eat some bad food, it makes you sick, and then you just can't touch that stuff again, right? So some peanut butter is a favorite one. I don't know, somebody had, whatever it is, but that's it. I'm done with that food for the rest of my life, right? And it's a very interesting kind of memory because it's very unusual in that, first of all, it's one trial. You eat the stuff, you get sick, that's it. And it will last for years and years. It's very hard to get past it. Secondly, there can be a significant time lapse between the time you eat the bad thing and the time you get sick, and you still relate it to that thing and you make this memory as well. And that's unusual. Usually things have to be sort of close together. So there's several unusual things about it, the strength and all that, and it's true for animals as well. So you can do this with animals. You can get a taste aversion going in your dog or whatever if you, if they eat something. Yes. So when these experiments have been done, there was a fellow named John Garcia many years ago, an animal behavior guy, who was trying to solve this problem of coyote predation on sheep out in the West, and these farmers were just killing off the coyotes, which was not a good idea because the coyotes were important for other things too. And so he used this taste aversion thing. He got a couple of sheep, which he slaughtered, and he left them out, and he laced them with lithium chloride. And the coyotes would come eat it. Lithium chloride will make you terribly sick, but you won't die from it. So these wolves would come eat, or coyotes would come eat the sheep, this lithium chloride-laced sheep, and go back to the burrows, they'd throw up, they'd be sick as a dog, as a bird, all night long. And that was it, man. They just wouldn't get near a sheep again or anything. Sheep, no, thank you. I'm not doing that. And so it worked, it was very effective.
That's great.
Yeah.
That's very, well, that makes me think actually. Well, one of the things you get, one of the questions you get a lot as a dog cognition researcher is about dogs eating feces.
Yeah.
Right. Just
cat feces, especially, apparently.
Right, cat feces, right, or just any kind of feces. Because basically, as a dog cognition researcher, you get every question about dogs, which comes to a kind of interesting idea. Well, I want to say two things. One, I think that's an interesting feature of science, is that if I'm doing experiments on a species, that it's assumed that there could possibly be answers to all the questions that we can formulate about them. And I think there is, actually, we're better at formulating questions than science is as an explanation mechanism. I mostly don't have explanations, but I mean, something like this, I would posit, I would look at natural behavior. First, I'd say, all right, why do other canids eat feces? Well, it could be nutritive, right? In other words, there could be nutrition in other animal species that they're getting, so that's useful. It could just be tasty, right? It could be just something that they like, right? And I'd say that those things probably are still hold for domestic dogs.
I think my dog just does it because he knows how much it upsets me.
Because he gets an immediate
He
reaction
gets an
from
immediate
you.
reaction.
If it's reliable, then that's another good reason to do it.
You're right.
Yeah. And it's reliable. About that.
Well, so if we can move away from feces
Yes.
for a minute. One of the nice things, I was going to say, one of the nice things that when I wrote Being a Dog, I did want to talk to olfactory researchers studying human olfaction to try to understand why this was a maligned sense among people. And most people will say, I think, that the sense they'd be most happy to lose
Yes.
would be smell.
Yeah.
And when I talk to you and some others, you basically, when I say, well, do you think we have a decent sense of smell? And you said, yeah. And your question is like, have you had food today?
Right.
How was your food?
Right, because as you pointed out, we both sort of pointed out, I guess, one of the problems with the human sense of smell is an access problem. Our noses are not down there where the good odors are. Our noses are small, and so there's not good access. But there's another way, in humans at least, and higher primates and humans, pretty much alone among us, that odors can also get to our olfactory epithelium up here. And that's what's called, I'm sorry for this word, the retronasal pathway, which simply
It's a
means...
great word.
I guess,
It means what it
you know,
says. Retronasal.
Yes. So the worst one is this way, sniffing it up this way. It's called the orthonasal pathway. And the retronasal pathway is when you put food in your mouth, close your mouth, ideally, if you have good manners, and chew, and that breaks, it releases all these odor molecules, and the pressure actually pushes them up into your nasal cavity through this backwards pathway. There's an opening back there.
Hence
that's
the
where
milk
you-
out the nose in the childhood cafeteria, right? That's how we knew there was a root.
That is the retronasal pathway. Probably how it was discovered. So we have a demonstration to show you this today, actually. Here.
Right. So to prove, if you were not convinced, that most of your sense of flavor is
Right.
due to the fact that you're smelling in this
Right, so-
retronasal way.
Right, so taste is only four things, really. Sweet, sour, salt, bitter, and actually this new taste called umami, which is not new, but we now recognize it means savory, and it's kind of found in Asian foods in particular, so that's why we know it now. Beyond that, everything else is what we should call flavor, which is a combination of these five tastes, the way something feels in your mouth, and mostly smell. So what I'd like each of you to do is to take two jelly beans, of two different flavors, not licorice. So leave the, if you love the licorice once, take it and eat it later. But for the purposes of this experiment, leave the licorice behind. And just pluck out two of two different flavors.
And don't eat them
And
yet.
don't eat them yet. Don't do anything with them until you've gotten all the
Don't smell them.
instructions.
Right.
Smell them, don't eat them. No, there's,
Don't smell
you
them.
can smell them.
Don't eat them.
You can actually, right, you can actually
They
smell.
probably don't have
You,
legs.
you'll find that they have very little smell, actually, right? So one of the curious things is, and this is research that's kind of ongoing and somewhat controversial, as to whether there's a difference in perception between the orthonasal and the retronasal pathway, whether the same chemical, if you will, the same odors or chemicals are perceived differently when you sniff it than when you...
Well, certainly, the smell of an orange
Yes, it's...
is not, to me, equivalent to the taste of an orange, right?
That's
And I
right,
think
that's
that's something more than I'm also getting sweet
Right,
in my
or
mouth.
sweet and acid and
A
juice
little,
and all that
right.
stuff. But I think it's also true that it's a different pathway, so there's
Yeah.
a different experience,
Yeah.
which is somewhat curious, right?
Yeah.
Does everybody have jelly beans?
So the interesting thing too is that we hope to prove that we're all great at retronasal olfaction,
Right.
but that dogs probably, it seems to me, have very little retronasal
Yes, yeah.
olfaction.
Yes.
And if you look at their natural behavior, you actually get some nice evidence of this. You don't have to open a
Well,
dog's head to see
they'll
this.
eat shit.
They'll eat shit. They smell things, but that's the smelling of something is their decision mechanism
Yes.
about whether to consume it, right? As opposed
Yes.
to us, where we're not often.
No,
Once in a
we
while,
don't.
we
Right.
don't spend a lot of time evaluating based on we just
We
put it in our
actually
mouth.
put it in our
That's how
mouth
we
and then
decide
we-
if it's good or bad. We'll spit it out. It's bad. The dog decides with the nose and then just gulps,
Yeah.
right? So they're probably not getting that chewing ruminative thing
Right.
to have
Whereas we have this
molecules.
very discriminating palate, actually.
Yeah,
Maybe the most
right.
discriminating palate on the planet, in
Yeah,
fact. And,
right.
we have chefs, we cook things.
We're
all sorts of
complimenting
crazy
ourselves here.
things.
All
Yeah.
right.
Okay, so here's what to do with the jelly beans. So, but don't do anything until I explain all the, so the jelly bean number one. what you're gonna do is you're gonna hold your nose closed and then put the jelly bean in your mouth and chew it up with your nose closed and leave it in your mouth. And then at some moment, I'll say, okay, undo your plug nose, and then gently breathe out through your nose. Gently out through your nose, okay? Are we ready for that? So everybody hold their nose. Good, can we get a picture of this?
Also, close
I've
your
many
eyes,
pictures.
stand up, and turn around.
So hold your nose, put one of the jelly beans in your mouth.
Not swallowing.
Don't swallow it. Just chew it up a little bit though, while your nose is, while you're, hold your nose, keep your nose closed. And you'll notice sweet, it's gloppy, okay. Now unplug your nose and then just breathe out gently. And suddenly the flavor appears, right? All right, now, swallow that jelly, or spit it out, or do something with it, all right? Now we take jelly, so now you're convinced that much of flavor, much of what you call taste, what should be called flavor, is really an olfactory experience. You're using your nose for that, and we're quite good at it. Now, just to show you how easily we fool ourselves, take the second jelly bean, which is now of another flavor, right? And just put that in your mouth and eat it the way you normally eat a jelly bean, and note what the flavor is. Just eat it, chew it up, got the flavor, right? It's different flavor. Now, here's my question. You have this flavor. Where do you detect the flavor of this second jelly bean? Is it in your mouth or in your nose? It's in your mouth, right? But it's not in your mouth. You just proved to yourself it's in your nose, right? So this is why you have to be careful of your brain. Your brain is out to fool you. It's a lying sack of whatever.
Well, this is very much what it's like to study dogs, because I and others will do simple experiments to try to test some of the statements that we make about dogs' life and experience, understanding, knowledge. And then you'll tell people what the studies have found, what we seem to know so far, and then they'll listen to you, and they can repeat it back to you, and then they say, "But my dog is actually different."
Yeah.
And all right, well, that's the brain for you.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, that's what we do, you know. And so you have to be very careful about these things, because your brain is really not the best evidence often for what's going on out there. You have to get a little bit deeper. You have to, ask a slightly deeper question. You can't really trust the thing, unfortunately.
Right.
People say, do you think we're smart enough to ever figure the brain out? And I think we are smart enough. I think the brain is smart enough to figure out how it works. Someday, maybe, whatever. But I don't think there's a limit there necessarily. I think the problem is that you can't do it by introspection. Having one kind of gets in the way of figuring out how it works. Because you have the sense about how it works, but that's generally not likely to be how it works.
Well, I see a fundamental problem here, though,
Yeah.
is that we can't get out of our brains.
No,
And the questions that we're asking are formulated by our brains.
yes, so it's I agree, it's a very tricky bit of business. That's why.
Yes, that's why we don't have the answer
It's
yet.
wonderful. My favorite statement about the brain, I always use this when I teach a class in neuroscience. So I always open the class on the brain with this joke from this comic named Emo Phillips, who's a California comic. Anyway, he says, I always thought my brain was the most wonderful organ in my body. And then one day I thought to myself, wait a minute, who's telling me that? And like all bets are off. I can't trust this thing. Right? That's it in a nutshell, isn't it?
Yeah.
So there you are, that's brain science. So anything you read about the brain, take it with a grain of salt, as they say.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, so one of the things which your most recent book that I was reading was on failure in science, which I thought is an interesting way to think about what science is about. And what I liked is that, especially, is that it kind of turns on its head the way that the public generally thinks about what the process of science is, what science is engaged in on a day-to-day basis, and also I think maybe goes against a lot of scientists' idea. I mean, for instance, I recently did a study in our lab where we had a lot of nice subjects. We did a lot of good data gathering, and we failed to get the result that we wanted to get. We had a hypothesis, it's a pretty good, robust hypothesis. Yeah. And this is not an uncommon phenomenon, right? In fact, you make the case in your book that this is sort of what we should expect most of the time.
Well, and it's in the end when things get most interesting. So mean, I don't know where to start with failure. It's
Yeah.
my favorite
Do
subject.
you have a personal failure you
Oh
want
my
to?
God, I have a list, a whole list of them. They're not that interesting. Well, but they are, without actually going into any of the particular details, although I could if you wanted to, the personal failures or the scientific failures are all, almost all, far more interesting than the successes. So you succeed in an experiment, the experiment works, you go, good, check that box off, that's fine. And it'll help you get to other questions and things like that. And so if you think science is about mystery and the stuff we don't know, the unknown, and all the rest of that, that's well and good. But then there's a sort of a really deeper kind, a really deep ignorance, which I would call the unknown unknown. You know, unfortunately made famous by Donald Rumsfeld, talking about the unknown unknowns, for which he was roundly ridiculed, this statement, although it's a very clever thing to say. Fortunately, he did not make it up. It actually first appears, as far as I know, in a poem by D.H. Lawrence, 1917, called New Heaven and Earth. Yes, nice to know that it wasn't Rumsfeld, isn't it? Anyway, it's near the last end, and he talks about the real unknown, the unknown unknown. And that's a really deep kind of ignorance. So how do you get to the unknown unknown? I would say the easiest, best way into the unknown unknown is failure. So you do an experiment. You did this experiment because you didn't know something. You thought we could find this out. So we set this up, here's what we think is going to happen. We do the experiment, doesn't work. Wow, so there was something we didn't know here. Now the game is really on. Now it gets interesting. Now it's not just the old crappy scientific method of a hypothesis and observation, that boring thing, right? Which it never really is. Now you need a little intuition, maybe a little inspiration, maybe a little luck, this and that, right? And then probably fail again, but you know, you're circling in on it. And so this is an immensely more interesting process.
Yeah.
And it's the one that makes things successful. It's the one that makes things work. Not actually succeeding all the time.
We had a really nice example from our lab of that, because when I got very interested in smell with dogs, this wasn't a way that people were looking at researching dogs, not in dog behavior, not in animal behavior, not in animal cognition circles, because we basically use a lot of approaches that are used with humans and sort of revise them for non-humans, and so they're mostly visual. A lot of the early studies with dogs were pointing tests because we're interested in if other animals can follow a point. Right, but that's not, I mean, they can, so that's to their credit, because they're not even that interested in points, right? They're interested in the smell that's wafting out from you when you point. But, so I started studying smell, and I thought, well, how do you do this? What can you present to the dog? How can you ask if they are more or less interested or know something or don't because of the smell? And so we did this interesting study with Julie Hecht, who's here, who was working in my lab at the time, and where we took a study that was already known, which was that dogs prefer, this is not a very surprising result, dogs prefer a plate that has 3 little pieces of hot dog over one that has 1 little piece of hot dog. They can visually tell the difference and will go for the 3. So it was a paper and a research interest in numerosity and if dogs can tell the difference between numbers of things, countable numbers of things. So we knew that they would prefer, and we all know that they prefer 3 pieces of hot dog. So we thought, well, they should be able to smell it, right? I mean, they're tracking dogs who can find somebody who's been missing for 2 days based on the scent left through that person's shoe on terrain. Mm-hmm. So they should be able to tell the difference between 1 and 3 pieces of hot dog. So we just covered the plates, presented them to the dogs to be sniffed, put them down, and let the dogs make a choice of which plate to go to. And they didn't go to the 3 hot dog one. Mm-hmm. And it was really surprising. Yeah. And it was fascinating because we thought, well, basically we realized, okay, there's something in the translation problem. I mean, it's still the case that the tracking dog is doing what the tracking dog does. But the translation problem is we're bringing the dog into this setting. This is why I think laboratory experiments and behavior of animals are troublesome. And the dog doesn't know what the task is. Right. The dog doesn't know what we're asking of them, and they're trying to figure it out. And they're not just having natural experience. So we looked again and the first thing we did was we presented the plates to the dog to be sniffed so that they would know which one is which, because we were interested in their first approach. So we're holding them up, and presenting them to be sniffed. And then we back up, put the plates down, and let them choose. We looked just at the amount of time they spent sniffing each of the plates. which was controlled by, that was supposed to be equal. We just looked at the amount they sniffed because they would grow uninterested. And they did sniff the larger quantity plate more. So they were recognizing it.
Yeah.
But then by the time we stepped back, put down the plates, and asked them to do something, they had either forgotten, didn't know, didn't track it, didn't make that translation. So what we learned was that, like, the task we had set up for them, so obvious for us, like, just make a choice.
Yeah.
Which plate do you want? It's not obvious for the dog, right? Instead, if we had looked at the mechanism that they're dealing on, which was just how much time you spend, more time sniffing is interest, then we would have gotten our answer without having to do the rest of it. So that was a pretty good failure and led to some evolution.
A much deeper sense of what goes on in a dog's mind,
right.
or what might go on in a dog's mind.
Right,
Absolutely.
and it was less about what the experimenters, the human experimenters
Right.
were thinking, yeah.
Right. So yes, I mean, this is how we, not so much stumble on things, is people like to talk about serendipity in science. I don't really like the idea so much myself. It happens a lot. It's certainly true that, you know, an unexpected result occurs, and if you're smart enough to recognize that it's a useful result, that's great, and you can say, well, it's serendipity. But, you know, lawyers don't make serendipitous scientific discoveries. So they may make legal discoveries, I don't know, but you have to be working on something for the serendipity to work. And usually what that means is you're working on something that has failed, and it's failed in an interesting way, like the quote that Caroline used in the beginning from, I think, Isaac Asimov, but every scientist really wants you to look at the data, is not eureka, but that's weird, right? Because that tells you there's something more here to do, right?
Do you think that your first success in olfaction was a result of failures before, or was it, how would you explain it?
Well, so my, let me see if I can explain it quickly. I want to leave time for questions.
Sure.
So no, my
You can
first.
just say yes.
Yes, but it was other people's failures in this particular case, which are also very
Right,
useful.
which we're all building on, right?
Absolutely.
Yes.
So that's critical too. You don't have to do the failure yourself. It's other people's failures that
Oh,
work out.
excellent.
for you.
I'm gonna work on that.
Yeah.
Okay. Should we, we'd love to take questions
Yeah,
if there are
yeah.
any. Yeah.
Yeah, I was told that women have a greater sense of smell than men do, and women can detect when there's a gas leak in the house when men will not. And I wondered if you could talk about that. I'd like to know.
My wife thinks I am the gas leak. That's another story altogether. Sorry. You know, it's an olfactory talk. You gotta expect this kind of
And also that you lose your sense of smell as you age. Is that?
Well, as I'm fond of saying, as far as I can tell, you lose everything except weight as you age. So that's the only thing that.
I mean, there is interesting about the neurons of the olfactory receptors is that they regenerate every 30 days or so, right? Which
yes
is,
and no.
yes and no. And but
yes, they can
every
regenerate.
process
Yes.
is getting worse over age. So even successful regeneration would
Yes.
diminish over time. But in theory, interestingly, they're regenerating regularly. So not that therefore we'd be better smellers, but that's what's necessary even to do the kind of feeble smelling that we do.
So the cells in our nose are true neurons. That is, they're actually the same as the cells in your brain that are stuck out in the nose, like the cells in your retina are. That's not true of your skin sensors, which are epithelial cells, or even your auditory sensors, which are epithelial cells. And so these are neurons, but they're actually exposed to the world. And so they get damaged quite easily, and so they need to be regenerated regularly. But in spite of that, yes, you do lose them. I'm not sure about the female versus male business in humans. There's no question that pregnant women certainly have a more sensitive sense of smell about many things. There's no question about that. I mean, it is started out as anecdotal evidence, but it's been tested fairly carefully. Beyond, do you know if there's a gender difference in dogs, or sex difference in dogs or other animals?
No. I mean, there are gender differences in dogs in terms of sniffing. One interesting one is that one study found that the female dogs, in meeting a new dog, will first sniff face first. In other words, they'll go up and sniff the face because there are all sorts of glands and interesting scents around the eyes, of course the mouth, and the ears. But males will go rub first. So you can kind of tell the sex of a dog.
Are we still talking about dogs?
Overall, by seeing which side they approach. I mean, they'll both go to each because they both have information, right? But that more often males go to the front, which makes sense because we know that olfaction is partially about getting sexual information for non-human mammals and maybe for humans as well. But females go to the face to get that information first. So there's that difference. I thought that there was decent evidence that females were overall better. I mean, it could be like, on what odorants are they better? There's so many different ways you could be better. You could be better at naming, identifying what odors are versus detecting them. You could be better at detecting, being able to tell the small amount. Or you could be better at discriminating them, like saying these are the same odors and that's a different one. So I felt like at least on one of those means, women were supposed to.
For example, now this is less true now, but it was true for many years, chefs and perfumers tended to be a male profession. Both professions that are really the only professions I can think of that require an extremely good
but that
sense of
could be
smell, right?
scientific evidence of something else.
Certainly. No, I agree, it's not good evidence, but, yeah,
So we don't have the answer.
we don't know. I will let you choose, I don't know.
Okay, I'm going to choose within the third row there, yeah.
Here's a question. When a dog is stressed, right? They yawn, rapid eye movement, but they also sniff. What do you think they're sniffing for? Like, why is that stress? Like, for instance, I compete with my dog, right? And we have one exercise that's called, we do scent articles. And he's actually looking for the hot scent, because I wrote my scent, they put it in a pile and he scents. But if he gets nervous, he starts sniffing.
Sniffing the ground?
Sniffing the ground. Now, we will say, as dog trainers, he's doing that because he's stressed. Because sniffing is one of those things that a dog does when they're stressed. And I'm wondering, like, what they're sniffing. Like, why is that relieving their stress?
In other contexts, I don't see sniffing being so roundly described as a stress behavior, So this context might be a special one for that. And that's an interesting observation, that it goes along with some other stress behaviors.
You don't think when a dog sniffs, that's one of the stresses?
No, I think it's just part of their perceptual world. Sniffing is just the way you get odors in your nose, so you have to be doing it pretty much continuously. So it might overlap with stress behaviors, right? So when you see another stress behavior, you might also see sniffing.
Right.
But if you were always looking at the nostrils, you would probably regularly see sniffing throughout.
Anyway.
But at any rate, so in this context, I'd have to just hypothesize. I mean, I don't really know, but it seems to me, I'm remembering this sort of analogy, potentially interesting analogy from the perfumer's world, which is that, and from just human smelling. We know if we are smelling something too much, you stop being able to smell it, right? If you're sniffing, you adapt to it, right? Right. That's what I was looking for, is it adaptive habituation? It's adapt, you adapt to it. So actually the sensory neurons stop firing, and you can't get more information about the smell. And so what the perfumers will do, because they're constantly having to evaluate different smells, which is sort of what your dog is doing, like evaluating
he's going around to everything to find out
where is this the one, is this the one?
Right.
Is they will try to get a sort of cleansing smell, right? And so the perfumers that I was studying with would smell the inside of their arm, like this, like just like a neutral smell. And of course, we don't smell that strongly to each other unless you're having a really ripe smelling day or just went for a jog or something. So it's a kind of non-smell, allows the sensory neurons to just refresh, and then they can go back about the business of investigating the smells. So I wonder if it's like a neutral.
It's like a break.
It's like a little break, and it's a useful time before getting back to the search in earnest, because you can get overwhelmed with smell. I mean, dogs' neurons function the same way. They'll adapt over time, and then they can't smell anything.
And there's a lot of other dogs that are scenting in that area for them. So it's possible that that's...
So maybe it's a useful break for them. That's my guess. Yes, right here.
So how do you know what smells the dog likes? I mean, for example, what are some smells that dogs like? You want to train your dog, or you want to befriend a dog, or whatever.
Food smells. Food smells. Well, there are a few, I think there really are a few smells that we found that dogs are aversive to, right? But But I mean, if you want to train a dog, any smell of food, of strongly smelling food, chicken, liver, bacon,
Bacon.
hot dogs, is very useful. I mean, you can overuse it, but
Are there any smells that they can smell that we can't smell?
Oh, yes.
So
that they
what-
like. Oh, well, I mean, there are plenty of things we're not smelling. I mean, they like all sorts of biological smells that we wouldn't want to be carrying around with us, right? And I don't know that they would be positive smells. In other words, they're not rewards necessarily. They're just information about who's around them and who's in the scene right now. You know, when we all leave this room, there will be smells of us here, right? And we are not thinking about it like that, but somebody entering the room afterward would sort of have a general smell of people, and the dog, your dog, would be able to recognize your seat, right? Because we have left, we're just sloughing off skin all the time, and with that, our smell, the bacteria in our smell. So those, I don't know that they're rewarding per se. I mean, if you want to train a dog, you need like a bacon smell. That's guaranteed success. Yes.
Human cognition. There was something in the Dana Foundation newsletter today about the importance of smell and human cognition. You referred to it in terms of smelling something that reminded you of memory. What are your most dramatic stories about human cognition and smell? You must have some from your experience and from your reading, maybe your experiments.
So just as a disclaimer, I don't really do cognitive neuroscience that much. I mean, I'm interested in it, I follow along as much as I can, but it's not an area that I'm actively engaged in. I think, so I have a slightly far out idea about cognition and consciousness, I suppose, but it's now being shared by other people as well. So in general, I think we all are beginning to recognize that what we call the motor side of the nervous system, the behavioral side, what makes us move around and all the rest of that, has gotten far too little attention over the years. We tend to be enamored with our sensory systems. You know, we can appreciate beautiful art or nice music or good food and all that, and this seems to be such an aesthetic kind of thing. Whereas the motor system seems to be such a kind of a,
Functional.
yeah, it's right, it's vocational somehow, right? It's just that end of it, it's kind of mechanical. But that turns out not to be the case, actually. It turns out that a great deal of our cognitive apparatus is involved in our behavior. And so what I find interesting about smell is, in that regard, cognitively, is that it's very closely wired to the motor system. So when I say wired, I mean, for example, in the olfactory system, to get from the outside world to cortical tissue, which is kind of the highest level of brain tissue, there are only two synapses. There are two sets of cells connected to each other. So you have the sensory neurons out here in the world. They send these wire-like extensions, we call them axons, back into your brain in an area called the olfactory bulb. They connect with another cell type there, and that cell type integrates information from lots of different receptors in your nose and sends that integrated bit of information to cells in the piriform cortex. And that's it, two synapses. Now in the visual system, two synapses, you're still in the outer retina, let alone the inner retina, let alone the thalamus and the lateral genicular nucleus and the visual cortex. So you're 8 synapses away from perception in vision, and you're only 2 synapses away in olfaction. And then there's a very close connection, we believe, into motor areas of the brain. So you smell something, you do something about it. We say smell regulates the 4 F's of behavior: feeding, fleeing, fighting, and mating. Does it work? Sorry, it's a science joke. It's corny, but so I think that's kind of where the cognitive end of smell comes up. I mean, there's the whole memory thing as well, but I find it more interesting and it's so totally tied to behavior, which I think is a very cognitive thing to do, actually. And the feedback that we get from behavior. So again, sniffing turns out to be something we've ignored in humans, and to some extent in other animals as well. I mean, the work on sniffing is no minor. She said the word sniffing I don't know how many times tonight, but it's not a minor issue, because the sniff rates are very important. People study this now in great detail. They're related to brainwave activity. And your brain, so as you sniff, your brain is set to take that sniff in, take that sniff in, take that sniff in. So even back here, it's not just, oh, I'll sniff because that's a good way to get a lot of molecules in. there's a rhythm to it, and there's an important rhythm to it, and that entrains the brain. The whole rest of the brain becomes entrained in that sniff rate, and then is set up to take that information and move it along.
And that reminds me of some facts, some
Good.
dog facts, which another sort of way that we're distinct from the dogs was that they can sniff about 5 to 10 times a second.
Yeah.
Was I think the human sniff rate is about 1 sniff every second and a half, right? Or so, like that. And the dog has done 15
Yeah.
sniffs at that point.
You do that, you'll pass out.
Yeah, no, we hyperventilate basically, right?
Yeah.
And then they also have that good, really nice exhale route, which is so nice, because if you want to exhale out a smell, we have to, you know how to get rid of that smell, this foul smell in the subway, is you just exhale it out,
Yeah.
right? Which you're literally pushing out the odorant from your nose. But dogs, getting information all the time, you don't want to exhale it out. So they have a mechanism where the exhales go out the side slits that the dogs have in their nose. So it doesn't disrupt continuous inhalation of more odors, which I think is lovely. And it creates a little stir in the ground and creates a little vortex, which sucks more odors in. So I think that's kind of a fabulous fact. I love that.
Yeah, it's remarkable,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
It's an engineering marvel, isn't
Right.
it?
So we need to learn how to do that, yeah.
Your YouTube example suggests that the capacity to smell is limited by distance. You said when the person came closer, then the dog stopped barking.
Yeah.
Okay, so how close? How far?
Well, so that's very relative. In other words, so basically all that has to happen is that odors have to be close enough to be sniffed. So there's a sniff reach. How far something needs to be, it's different for a dog, it's different than for us. But we can't sniff we're not gonna sniff anything that's more than a few inches from our nose. And that doesn't mean we're seeing it. It's just that the odor is in the air, or the molecule is in the air, and then it gets to within the strength of our sniff reach, and we can suck it in. So for dogs it'll be the same. But I mean, there might be a breeze that brings someone's odor or something's odor towards the person, towards the snout, so that the person could be quite far away, and you have a fan behind them, there's a breeze behind them, and their odor will come closer to the nose. Or it could be, this is why the long proved method of giving your hand to the dog to be smelled, right? They can get a close examination that can be within a couple of inches, and they're getting information about you.
I was wondering whether the experiment would have different results offering the 1 hot dog and 3 hot dogs if there was competition for the dog.
Oh, yeah.
The dog was trusting that it was going to have the opportunity to make the sweep or perhaps even the minute.
Right, yeah, that's a great question, right? So the social, they might be making a different evaluation, though that might have given another pressure for them to attend in a different way, yeah. You can be designing our next one, yeah.
Has there been any study to see whether there is any difference between the smelling abilities of wolves versus dogs, recognizing, I could be wrong about this, that when you say dogs, one might say which breed?
Sure, yeah, what kind of dog? Right, and dogs do differ in the number of olfactory receptor cells they have. Some have been genetically bred to be air scenting or ground scenting dogs. We know that these brachycephalic dogs, like the pug and the short-nosed dogs that have short skulls that have been bred for their looks, they actually have considerably diminished smelling capacity as a result of having the mechanism, blocked, basically. The nostrils are blocked. Has there been a study between wolves and dogs on their smelling rate? I don't believe so. I mean, it would generally be considered that wolves their sense of smell is probably better than dogs because they're breeding themselves, right? The evolution breeds animals are going to be able to explore their environment more successfully, whereas that hasn't been something that we have selectively bred for in most cases. In fact, it's something we might be averse to. Maybe most of us would be happy with a dog, breeding a dog that is not smelling at all, because a lot of the dog smelling behaviors we find to be impolite, right, or misbehaviors. So we kind of accidentally have encouraged the breeding of dogs who are not these working dogs who are kind of probably going to be underperforming in smell. I do know, but I don't know anyone's looked at it. I know that the brain of the dog is the volume is actually less than the brain of the wolf, and that probably means that all the correlate areas are smaller in the dog. That size doesn't necessarily mean that they're worse at it. And yeah, there are some captive wolf populations that are enculturated. I don't know that any of them have looked at it. It's an interesting question. Yeah.
I read this on the internet, so it has to be true. But I just had a question. You might have answered it with what you were saying before about the side slits and the exhaling. But what I read was that a dog could smell on the exhale as well as the inhale. Is that true?
Well, if in effect on the exhale they're still inhaling, then I guess in a way it's true. And there would be one other way. I've never heard that per se. I mean, I would just say they're constantly inhaling, almost like circular breathing of a wind player. So that maybe there's no express exhale time. They're just continually inhaling. But potentially, you could almost say that in an exhale they're smelling too, because some of those bones in the nose, those turbinate bones, are lined with cells, olfactory receptor cells, which is a little different than in our nose, where they're all at the back of the nose. I mean, this is all where the smelling stuff happens, right? But for the dog, some of them are in here. So if they're exhaling, then they're passing those receptor cells again. So maybe some of those fire some perceptus forms potentially, but I haven't heard about that. So go check your internet stories. Yeah.
I've always been interested in how it is that a dog manages to anticipate a medical condition by smell. Could you shed any light on that?
Right. I mean, there's some really interesting research now with cancer detection dogs and a lot of trials. There are seizure detection dogs that are employed. There are diabetes alert dogs, hypoglycemia detection dogs. And I mean, in all of those cases, well, we don't know exactly what's happening with dogs who are potentially detecting a seizure before it happens, as opposed to dogs who are there to help the person get to a safe place when they're having a seizure. But in all other cases, it is olfactory, and it's that the smell of the disease, in the case of the cancer, that there is a smell to disease. And this is something human noses know as well. You know, I mean, for a long time, doctors would smell samples to determine what the illness was that their patient had. And we've just gotten it's out of fashion.
Up through the 1950s, by the way. It's not like this is ancient medicine.
Yeah, and there's still, I mean, if you're somebody who works in infectious diseases, in medicine, you're still probably smelling samples to see what kind of infection that you have, because they all have a smell. So the cancer cells have a smell. Now, we don't know exactly what it is in that smell, exactly what component, and to be sure, there are people trying to find out what the specific thing is that the dogs are signaling on, because people want to create an electronic nose that can go through, and you can, a wand that you can wave over somebody and say, oh look, yep, melanoma at 4 o'clock, as opposed to having a dog come in and smell samples of tissue. But it's because all these things have smells if to a dog, to an instrument that's as sensitive as the dog is.
That said, I still rather have a cat skin.
I didn't realize that there was a font of olfactory jokes, but I'm glad we're getting them all here. It's just, yeah, right in the back.
Don't forget about the lab report.
Yeah, very good.
I'm wondering whether there are any studies about different societies that were more in tune with nature, and just whether there's studies showing that people had better senses of smell then.
I don't really know. I mean, I assume there's an anthropological literature on this, and probably an archaeological one, which I'm only vaguely a little bit more familiar with. I mean, perfumes and things like that, spices and all interest in spices has a long archaeological record. I mean, apparently we fought wars over them and things of that nature. Whether or not people who live, in a more native state, if you want to put it that way or not, or more finely attuned to odors, I mean, Perhaps, I don't know, I think we're generally speaking fairly finely attuned to odors, so I'm not sure, to tell you the truth.
There is, I know that there is linguistic work, of people
yes.
who study tribal peoples that they have a really rich vocabulary for talking about odors. Is it correlated with a better sense of smell? I don't know. But I do think that a lot of the perfumer's skill is not just all that time spent sniffing, but also naming what they're smelling so that they can retrieve it later, recognize it later, draw connections between things that they have named and experienced in the past, as opposed to us who walk by the metallic-y smell, we don't know what it is, and we just pass it. But, so there are communities that have, I mean, English doesn't have a lot of dedicated words for odors, right? We have no primary colors words for odors. We have words that evoke the thing that the odor came from, potentially. So that smells like orange, that smells like the sewer, that, you know, but not a specific word for orangey. Right, like red. And these people do have specific words, and they cover really interesting groups of smells that we wouldn't think are together, like the smell of mushrooms in forest, plus the smell of a knife on a warm day. Like those are part of the same smell category for this group of people. So it's certainly the case that there are present examples of people who have a different experience with smell based on their, more hunter-gathery lifestyle than our lifestyle.
What was the other thing you said from South Asia? We have the five senses.
Well, the
Umami.
fifth taste is known as umami, which is a Japanese word that translates loosely into savory. It's a sort of a taste of protein, so it's in meat, but it's also in tomatoes. The gooey part
Parmesan.
of the tomato is umami, that flavor.
Mushroomy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it is an important fifth taste, as it were.
It wasn't really recognized in Western science for a long time,
Right.
But it was in Eastern cuisine.
We finally decided to recognize it in the Western world when we discovered the molecular receptor for it. So once you have a gene for it, it must be.
It exists.
That's it, right, yes.
Ultimately, verifying your career
The
in molecular
embodiment, the true
biology.
embodiment of reality, yes.
Okay, we'll take maybe one more question there.
Hi, did you find that in your research that people who lose one of their senses, the others compensate and become stronger, like the sense of smell? Or do you lose your eyesight or your hearing? Like,
There's that notion, but I don't know that there's good evidence that the brain literally reorganizes to commit space, that would otherwise be for vision to smell.
It's hard to disambiguate that from just attention. I mean, so you pay attention to whatever information comes in, and so if there are fewer channels, each channel that's still coming in simply gets more of your attention time, I think, as much as anything else. At least it's hard to discriminate between that and whether or not you actually improve significantly.
just rely on.
Yeah.
Right, so if you spend less time when you go into a room looking around, but close your eyes and try to smell around, you suddenly will have this, notice you have this little bit of a superpower growing.
So do dogs ever become anosmic?
Apparently so, although there haven't been veterinary tests. They're not standard veterinary tests for it, because the veterinary tests are kind of promoted by the things that owners are going to ask and want to know about their dogs, and we don't really notice for the most part.
Yeah.
If maybe people would think it's sort of a desirable thing that their dog has stopped sniffing so much, right, and maybe they've lost some interest in licking, or but
Right.
so we don't know. I don't think there has been any good study on it. We have to assume that they would also, if they got to a nice old age, would lose some sense of smell naturally. Yeah. Okay.
Interesting.
Thank
Thank
you
you.
so much.
Thank you.
And if anyone here, like me, likes to sniff books,
I'm sure there's some nice smelling books
we've got some
available.
nice
We will
smelling books,
happily
like
sign.
our authors, for sale by the book.
I'll rub them all over me.
Yeah, you guys good stuff.
I know. More than the good things, unfortunately. Yeah. More than the good things. Yeah. It's good seeing you. Well, I mean, we're like.
That's what everybody thinks.